and therefore must be a single point of failure. The red telephone on the president's desk is such a mechanism. Having 23 red telephones would be far worse than having one red telephone. As such, that single red telephone deserves defense in depth, and defense in depth is simply a referendum on your willingness to spend money for multiple layers. It is rarely, if ever, a research-grade problem. The other national security scale concern is cascade failure. And cascade failure is so very much easier when the attacker only has to write one bit of malware, not 10 million. The idea is obvious. Believing in it is easy. Acting on it is evidently rather hard. I note in passing that the population statistics for platforms, operating systems, and tools present amongst you sitting in this room today bear no resemblance to the public at large. And as such, you are here collectively acting on the diversity belief, even if you cannot sell the idea beyond such baby steps as address space location randomization, the existence of which I view as total vindication of the monoculture thesis. What I'm driving at is that the natural world has lessons for us that we are pretty miserable, and that we are pretty miserable at intelligent design, provably poorer at it than whatever process brought nature to us in the state it was in before we began to demolish it. In the natural world, a high presence of attack pressure must and does result in a high rate of mutation. What part of your body suffers the most daily insults and mutates all day, every day? Answer: E. coli in your gut. Their mutation rate rises and falls in reaction to stress, since if things are going well, a mutation is likely to be deleterious, whereas if things are going badly, it may be the last chance. And in any case, reproductive fidelity is more metabolically expensive than producing mutations. I suggest that some doctoral student might take a close look at whether a withering digital attack ought to provoke some adaptive mutation in the target. Put differently, if you are losing a game you cannot afford to lose, change the rules. Social insects are the great success story in the natural world. There are 2 to the 50th ants on this planet. The biomass of ants and termites is 1/3 of all terrestrial animals, and honeybees alone confer more economic benefit to humanity than all other insects combined collectively withdraw. I simply do not have time today to go into all the ways that social insects and armies of computers on networks are alike, so I'll just refer you, if I may, to my paper in ACMQ from last April. One hint: researchers were able to show with honeybees precisely what I said was true for computer monocultures, that a hive, all genetically identical, either wins decisively or loses catastrophically, while a hive with the genetic diversity neither wins nor loses in any spectacular fashion at all. In the natural world, a plant that has been eaten alive by, say, aphids will manufacture a come-hither scent that draws ladybugs. If you're a ladybug and you smell that "the aphid diner is now open" aroma, what would you do? Bank tellers may well cooperate with a robber, but you can bet they've pressed the button on the floor that calls the gendarmes. We do this with our honeypots. They allow themselves to be taken down by some thug, all the while snapping pictures for the network police. In a sense, our intrusion detection systems do the same. They call the police while they are possibly going down. Honeypots are, if nothing else, a kind of mimicry. Nature has dozens of kinds of mimicry. To mention just 2, there's Batesian mimicry, where some prey species tries to look like some non-prey species, a sheep in wolf's clothing, as it were. And there's Mullerian mimicry, where all the ones that say taste bad look alike to make up for slow learners amongst the predators. To my knowledge, we don't have much of this kind of protective mimicry in the computer field, at least yet. We have the reverse. Honeypots do try to look tasty and vulnerable when they are not. As such, honeypots are more like anglerfish. And as with everything else today, we may have something to learn from nature. Perhaps every network segment needs a honeypot, a model that the common field cricket uses, when the male who is singing is targeted by predators, but that male will be surrounded by other males who do not sing, only mate. Maybe the answer is just coexistence, which OASIS in the US or MAFTIA in Europe call intrusion tolerance. It isn't as if there is any new news in saying that by now we simply shouldn't have buffer overflows in applications, yet of course we still do. Perhaps the answer is to just learn to tolerate those overflows and the intrusions they tend to enable. Medical science hasn't solved the common cold either. We've just learned to tolerate it after effectively giving up on immunization as a public health strategy. There are 350,000 species of beetles, which led the biologist Haldane to say that the creator, if he exists, has an inordinate fondness for them. This degree of special speciation means beetles have an authentication problem. That is to say, with whom can I mate? We do authentication using cryptographic keys and locks, and keys and locks are not interchangeable. Beetles have the analog equivalent. The mechanics of the male's penis will only match the mechanics of a female of the same species. enough so that properly curated specimens in museum collections will exhibit the penis adjacent to but detached from the rest of the specimen. One can stretch and say that the various mating dances of beetles and other higher forms are just so much pre-authentication. While some people like to say that specialization is for insects, tell me that the security field itself is not busily specializing. We have people who are expert in forensics on specific operating system localizations, expert in setting up intrusion response, expert in analyzing large sets of firewall rules using non-trivial set theory, expert in designing egress filters for universities that have no ingress filters like MIT next door, expert in steganographically watermarking binaries, and so forth. Generalists are becoming rare, and they're being replaced by specialists. This is speciation in action and the narrowing of niches. In rough numbers, there are somewhere close to 5,000 various technical certifications that you can get in the computer field, and the number of them is growing, thus proving the conjecture of specialization and speciation is not just for insects, and it will not stop. Lest you think that it's too far-fetched to consider a computer a life form, subject to evolution just like any other life form, consider embedded systems. They're already 2 orders of magnitude more numerous than keyboards and displays, hence the future with threat space, which we must lead the same way the hunter leads the deer while hunting, is this threat space where a computer is not identifiable as such, but is instead inside some nondescript appliance. So should or should not an embedded system have a remote management interface? If it does not, then a late discovered flaw cannot be fixed without visiting all those embedded systems, which is likely to be infeasible, both because some will be where you cannot go, and there'll be too many of them anyway. If it does have a remote management interface, the opponent of skill focuses on that, and once a break is achieved, will use those self-same management functions to ensure that not only does he retain control over the long interval, but as well you will be unlikely to know that he is there. This leads to a proposal on what to do about the future. Embedded systems, if having no remote management interface and thus out of reach, are a life form, and as the purpose of life is to end, an embedded system without a remote management interface must be so designed as to be certain to die no later than some fixed date. Conversely, an embedded system that does have a remote management interface must be sufficiently self-protecting that it is capable of refusing a command. A lot of people say that complexity is the enemy of security, and I'm one of them. But at the same time, I'm here to argue that we have to learn from nature precisely because nature is the most complex thing we will ever see. Nature is an existence proof that complexity is not the enemy of life, but complexity is the enemy of stasis. Our problem is that we've pretty much equated security with stasis, and it is slowly getting us into trouble. Take forest fires. If you always quench them, such as to protect vacation homes and tourist dollars, then you necessarily build up the supply of unburned